Hey everybody, this is chapter 2 of Mark Poster's Existential Marxism in Postwar France from Sartre to Althusser. Chapter 2 of this book is in part 1 of the book, titled Neither Idealism Nor Materialism, and chapter 2 is titled Rediscovery of Marx and the Concept of Alienation, with the headings Stalinism and the French Communist Party, Lukacs and Goldmann, the 1844 Manuscripts, the Objections of the French, Two Marxes or One. Alright, so let's rock. Section 1. Stalinism and the French Communist Party. Marxism was slow in coming to France. The intellectual competitors of Marxism, Blanqui's Jacobinism and Proudhon's syndicalism, dominated the French workers' movements well into the 20th century. Early importations of Marxist thought by Gued and Jaurès, I think I'm pronouncing those names right, but just if I'm not, just know I'm saying pronouncing G-U-E, I think with an accent, S-D-E, and for Jaurès, J-A-U-R-E with an accent, S. Anyway, moving on. So take all my pronunciations with a grain of salt. Early importations of Marxist thought by Gued and Jaurès failed to evoke a wide interest in the theoretical text of socialism. Between 1929 and 1934, a first group of intellectuals was constituted to study and propagate Marxism. The group consisted of Georges Politzer, Henri Lefebvre, Norbert Gutermann, Georges Friedman, Pierre Mourhang, and Paul Nizan. Closely allied to the Communist Party, this group concerned itself with refuting the dominant philosophical traditions of Cartesian rationalism and Bergsonian vitalism. A second group, clustered around the journal La Pensée, Revue des Rationalismes Modernes, was led by prominent scientists who were Communist Party members, such as Paul Langevin, Marcel Prenant, Frédéric Joliot-Curie, Henri Wallon. Founding in 1933, La Pensée, which is L-A space P-E-N-S-E with an accent, E without an accent. Founded in 1939, La Pensée was openly positivist, limiting, quote, dialectical materialism, and, quote, to a method of research. Leaning heavily on the French encyclopedist tradition, it advertised Marxism as the only philosophy compatible with scientific rationalism. Both groups of French Marxists, without an economist among them, wanted to have communism bask in the radiant prestige of the progress of natural science. Pulitzer, recognized by many as the most brilliant of the early Marxists, proclaimed that, quote, materialism is no more than the scientific understanding of the universe, end quote. Pulitzer, essentially a, quote, continuation of the materialism of Diderot and the 18th century. This positivist Marxism continued to predominate in the thought of the younger generation of Communist Party theorists after the liberation. Writing in 1946 at the height of the power of the Communist Party, resulting from its leadership in the resistance, Roger Garaudy safely delineated Marxism as scientific, moral, and French. The image of Marxism drawn by Communist Party apologists like Garaudy was not an open critical theory that could lead to strategies for smashing oppressive institutions, but of a respectable, elevated, very French philosophical doctrine. The celebrated leader of the French Communist Party at this time, Maurice Thorez, could say nothing better of Marxism than that it was, quote, a proven scientific theory, end quote. In the line of, quote, potent minds, end quote, that stretched from, quote, Rabelais, that's R-A-B-E-L-A-I-S, Helvetius, I mean, that's like a big materialist from France, from Diderot to Victor Hugo, from Zola to Anatole France. Unquote. Two factors determined the fate of French Marxism through the 1940s: the political context of Stalin's International and the belated introduction of the corpus of Marx's writings. No more striking instance of the influence of politics on intellectuals can be named than the power Joseph Stalin exercised over French Marxists from the mid-1930s until the mid-1950s. The primary task of Marxist intellectuals was to defend the Soviet Union, to twist Marxism into a theory that explains Soviet society and demonstrate its superiority over capitalism. This situation was even more constraining because Stalin used the European parties to suit the needs of Soviet interests, so that French Marxists were compelled to argue that the revolutionary role of the French party, when in fact Stalin was dictating a conservative role for it. Footnote: see David Kaut's book, Communism and the French Intellectuals. For a general discussion of the French Communist Party during this period, see Alfred J. Reber's book, Stalin and the French Communist Party. End footnote. In the years immediately after World War II, at a time of revolutionary fervor in France, Moscow embraced de Gaulle, and the Communist Party had to restrain its militants in favor of Stalin's policy of stability in Europe. Marxists could not escape the understandable dilemma of supporting Russian socialism, a palpable reality, and at the same time wanting to revolutionize French capitalism. The Soviet Union was simply the homeland of socialism for intellectuals who, enchanted by its spell, invested in it all the dreams of an emancipated humanity. Footnote: for an example of this argument by a Communist Party intellectual that indicates the incredible force of Stalinism, see Edgar Morin, Autocritique, 1959. One second. Yeah, I don't think he was a Communist Party guy, Edgar Morin. Maybe I'm wrong. The Wikipedia says... Oh no, he was part of the Communist Party. Okay. I don't know. I don't know this person. But I feel like I've seen this person's names in different contexts in this. Anyway. Where the hell am I? End footnote. After 1947, with the outbreak of the Cold War, the emergence of Zhdanovist doctrine of the two camps and the exclusion of the Communist Party from the government, it became very difficult for party intellectuals to write critically, unless one were prepared to fall into the camp of the Americans with their anti-communism, and very few French intellectuals were. Marxism had to be identified with Russian socialism without qualification. The relation of intellectuals to the party is difficult to understand. The explanation by sociological reasons, such as the disparity between working class or peasant party leaders and bourgeois intellectuals, fails to recognize the power of Stalinist Russia over the intellectuals and their willing submission to dialectical materialism. Footnote: this is a common error of historians and political scientists. See, for example, Richard Johnson's book, The French Communist Party versus the Students. End footnote. On the other hand, the party was led by the politicians, and the role of intellectuals is entirely subordinate. To the degree that the praxis of the party was guided by theory, it was the theory of Stalin, who was considered the true interpreter of Marx and Lenin. Yet the attitude of the party towards intellectuals did vary in the post-war years. At times, usually when the party was courting intellectuals, published works were not carefully scrutinized for orthodoxy, and some degree of open debate was possible. In the main, for Communist Party intellectuals, it was not possible to apply Marx's ideas to the concrete history and direction of Western European societies. It took several decades before Marxism could be extricated from its identification with the Soviet Union, before the Soviet Union itself could be analyzed critically. Just as a side note, I mean, the Soviet Union was analyzed critically. It should be noted that the French Trotskyist, the wing of French Trotskyism was quite large, and some of Trotsky's biggest supporters were from France, such as Alfred Rosemer, both of these people had more critical stances, but Alfred Rosemer as well as Boris Souverine. Boris Souverine kind of having more like Cold War-ish politics, I think, by the end of World War II, but his book on Stalin, translated by C.L.R. James into English, was a major book that was published in France this time. Anywhooser. And then, of course, not to mention, I don't know when this will be brought up, but like Socialisme Barbarie starting to gain traction in the 1950s among certain circles, at least. Anyway, just kind of pushing back against this idea that the Soviet Union was not criticized from a Marxist perspective in this period. That seems a little too strong of a statement. Unless Marxism is strictly associated with Communist Party Marxism, which I don't think is fair to say it is. Anyway, moving on. The addition to being constrained by the necessity of apologizing for Stalin's, quote, socialism in one country, Marxists were hamstrung by the philosophical pretensions of Stalin. In the Communist Party, Marxism was presented as a finished philosophy, known as Diamat, consisting of 7 theses, 3 principles, and 4 traits, and communist intellectuals were encouraged simply to repeat and apply these, quote, truths. Under the aegis of Russia's philosopher king, Marxism became a closed system of ideas. French Trotskyists, like Pierre Nivelle, who were critical of Stalin's Russia, were themselves wedded to the idea that the October Revolution was the realization of Marx's proletarian revolution. That seems like a true statement. French Marxists dutifully imitated Stalin's formulation of Diamat. There's 2 footnotes here. Footnote. In this early period, only Karl Korsch, in the book Marxism and Philosophy, translated by Fred Halliday into English in 1970, originally published in 1923, seriously attempted a Marxist analysis of Marx. The Communist Party intellectual Georges Cogniot was still finding the USSR as the, quote, embodiment of democracy, end quote, in 1968. See his book, Karl Marx, Note Contemporaine. And footnote. See Joseph Stalin's Dialectical Materialism in this collected volume, Leninism Selected Writings. End footnote. Revolutionary theory was schematized into 2 parts: dialectical materialism, a phrase never used by Marx, and historical materialism. The dialectic emerged as a metaphysical postulate about objective exterior reality. Materialism signified that, quote, matter is primary, end quote, that mind is secondary, ... since it is a reflection of matter, end quote. Stalin. The 2 principles combined precisely how was left unclear, constituted the, quote, philosophy of Marxism, from which historical materialism, the method of understanding society and providing a guide for the praxis of the proletariat, was derived. Historical materialism meant little more than economism. The economic base determined the political, legal, and ideological superstructures in a unilinear, mechanical manner. Stalin's placing language in between the 2 would be an exception to this reductionism. Since the relative autonomy and the reciprocal influence of the superstructure were denied, historical materialism ended in an abstract analysis of the economy along with a characterization of man as homo economicus. Historical materialism limited Marxists either to empty hopes of a catastrophic upheaval or to collaborating with the Fourth Republic and de Gaulle for economic trade unionist benefits. This Marxism could be seen as an ideology serving the defensive interests of Stalin's authoritarian state, which felt itself beleaguered by imperialist capitalism. Divorced on the popular base, the state was systematically modernizing Russia. And in its own way, Diomet reflected the dualism and the materialism of a society that was, quote, conquering nature, end quote, under the leadership of a small elite. Most intellectuals gradually saw that Marxism in its Stalinist form would never be a revolutionary theory in Europe. In the West, a critical theory would have to account for the development of capitalism since 1900, oligopolistic concentration, the state's entry into the market, advanced technology leading toward automation, the transformation of the workforce toward increasingly skilled mental labor, the direct manipulation of needs through advertising, the pacification of the traditional proletariat, and the transformation of the areas of gratification from work to consumption and leisure. Faced with these profound transformations, French communist intellectuals could only incant the tenets that applied in mid-19th century Europe. Capitalism would collapse by itself. The workers were subject to increasing pauperization. Manual laborers were the only human beings capable of a socialist revolution. Ouvrier-isme. I guess that's workerism. A hierarchical Leninist party alone could lead the revolution. The revolution would be an apocalyptic transformation of the world on the model of 1789 and 1917. Leftist intellectuals accepted Communist Party Marxism only as an expedient under Cold War conditions in which even bourgeois liberties were jeopardized by latent or overt fascist tendencies. Equally significant for the understanding of the slow development of an open Marxism in France was the absence of most of the text of Marxism. In the 19th century, only Capital, the Communist Manifesto, and Marx's politico-historical writings were translated into French. The Molitor translations began in 1927 with Marx's doctoral dissertation and the Holy Family. The German Ideology and all-important Paris manuscripts of 1844, known in France as Économie, Politique et Philosophie, did not appear until 1937. Even then it was ignored until after the liberation. Footnote: many of the commentators on the 1844 manuscripts complained about the omission and errors in the Molitor translation. For one thing, it came from the Landshut and Mayer edition of 1932, which had deep flaws, according to Rebel. Molitor left out much of the all-important section on, quote, alienated labor, end quote. The first adequate translation was Émile Bottigelli's, published by Edition Sociale, a Communist Party house, in 1962. There was one earlier appearance in French of parts of the 1844 manuscripts. Henri Lefebvre and Norbert Guttermann of the, quote, Philosophies group published sections of it in their journal Revue Marxiste, number 1, in the mid-1920s. They also reprinted tiny sections of it in the book Karl Marx, Monsieur Choisy. I don't know. However, in the 1940s and 1950s, these publications were totally ignored. End footnote. The critique of Hegel's philosophy of right appeared a little earlier in 1935, but the Grundrisse, which showed the continuity of Marx's thought from the 1844 manuscripts to Capital, was not published in French until 1967. So after reading Capital by Althusser and friends, Balibar and Rancière, and so on. The important works of Lenin and Engels were slow in coming. The book Materialism and Imperial Criticism, published in 1928, the notebooks on Hegel in 1938, Engels' Dialectic of Nature in 1957. The most important of these texts were not even available in German. The 1844 manuscripts in German Ideology became available in 1932, the Grundrisse in 1939. Clearly, for political and textual reasons which are interconnected, no real reading of Marx was possible in France until after the Second World War. New section, Lukacs and Goldmann. When French social theorists began after World War II rereading Marx, particularly the young Marx of the 1844 manuscripts, and reformulating Marxism around the pivotal idea of alienation, they discovered a Marxist tradition spiritually close to themselves. This tradition, which Merleau-Ponty called, quote, Western Marxism, had spoken earlier in the 20th century against a direction of Marxism that was very similar to Stalinism. The Western Marxists rejected positivism, a view of dialectical materialism fashioned after the sciences of nature as well as economism. Apparently, Marxism had a tendency to become distorted in this specific direction, a tendency that has yet to be explained adequately. The Western Marxists were primarily Germans who wrote their revisions of Marx in the 1920s and early 1930s. I don't think a lot of these figures would view them as being revisions of Marx. but a certain rescuing of Marx from what might be called an Engelsian or Second Internationalist interpretation. That's just a side note. The group includes Ernst Bloch, whose Geist der Utopie of 1918 emphasized the futurist utopian element in Marxism, the Hungarian Georg Lukács, whose Geschichte und Klassenbewusstsein, History and Class Consciousness of 1923, foreshadowed the discussions of the concept of alienation, Karl Korsch, whose Marxismus und Philosophie of 1923 was an early attempt to bring Marxist criticism to the Marxist movement itself, and Herbert Marcuse's, whose Hegels Ontologie und die Grundlegung einer Theorie der Geschichtlichkeit of 1932 took some of its impulses from the existentialism of Martin Heidegger. Marcuse later joined the Frankfurt School of Marxists, Horkheimer, Adorno, Fromm et al., whose project of developing a, quote, critical theory of society, end quote, was the basis of the Western Marxist tradition. Mention was also made by the French of the Italian theorist and organizer Antonio Gramsci, whose ideas of bourgeois hegemony underscored the need to refute bourgeois ideology and develop a Marxist culture, pointing to the importance of the, quote, superstructure, end quote. In their efforts to rethink the basic questions of Marxism, many of the Western Marxists, to a greater or lesser extent, relied on some form of existentialism, with its concern with the human subject, its concept of freedom, and above all, the primacy it gave to time or historicity as the ground of human reality. Footnote. Paul Brines, Breines, suggests, or Brines, suggested this point to me. A similar argument is made by Walter Kaufmann in his introduction to Richard Schacht's book Alienation, published in 1971. And footnote. Marcuse, for example, had been a student of Heidegger. More relevant for the French was the existentialist component in the Marxism of Georg Lukács. Lukács was a student of Max Weber and Georg Simmel, and even in his early literary works took Simmel's notion of human alienation and gave it a Marxist twist. Footnote. See Andrew Arato's article, Lukács' Path to Marxism, 1910 to 1923. End footnote. Lukács was contemplating during this early period a study of the first great existentialist Søren Kierkegaard, and he acknowledged the impact of the Danish philosopher made on him. Once Lukács was exiled in the Soviet Union, he conformed to the orthodoxy of Marxist-Leninism and publicly renounced his earlier work. With the book History and Class Consciousness under the cloud of a Russian ban, Lukács' public denials about his past were always received with some skepticism in the West, a skepticism partly confirmed by Lukács' endorsement of a German republication of History and Class Consciousness in 1967, and the appearance in 1948 of his Der Junge Hegel, which he had been quietly working on while in the Soviet Union. I think this is kind of a mischaracterization, perhaps, because I think that for instance, in the French, but maybe he'll talk about this in a little bit, but I think in France, when people tried to translate History and Class Consciousness, I think in the journal Argument, which is, according to Christos Memos, was kind of like a spearhead of a certain open Marxism in France. I think he, what was I going to say? Certain, what the hell was I going to say? When they were trying to publish it, he definitely bucked against republication of History and Class Consciousness, at least in that case, I'm pretty sure. But I think in general, I don't know, maybe I'm wrong, but I don't think he particularly appreciated it being like republished by the anti-authoritarian or the student movement in Germany. But I'm not exactly sure. It says here that he endorsed a republication of History and Class Consciousness. I think people were already publishing, but in like an underground level, and I don't know if he particularly approved of that. But I'm not an expert on Lukács' history. Anyway, the final section of the book was on the suppressed topic of alienation. Where the hell am I? Where the hell am I? The final section of the... Where the hell am I? With History and Class Consciousness under the cloud of a Russian ban, Lukács' public denials about his past were always received with some skepticism in the West, a skepticism partly confirmed by Lukács' endorsement of a German republication of History and Class Consciousness in 1967, and the appearance in 1948 of his Der Junge Hegel, which he had been quietly working on while in the Soviet Union. The final section of the book was on the suppressed topic of alienation. Although Lukasz's reputation was somewhat tarnished by his public Stalinism, he remained the leading Marxist philosopher and literary critic in the eyes of many French thinkers. Lukasz's Existential Marxism was transmitted to France by Lukacs and Goldmann, most notably in the book Kant und Recherches. Kant, in his book Kant, the book is just called Kant, and the book Recherche Dialectique, which I think is dialectical research, I'm not sure, published in 1959, and placed at the center of Western Marxism by Maurice Merleau-Ponty in the book Adventures de la Dialectique of 1955, which I think is Adventures of the Dialectic. Although the book History and Class Consciousness was not translated into French until 1960, it was the most important influence on the direction of French Marxism after the Liberation. In the 1967 preface, Lukács acknowledged that his book, History and Class Consciousness, was the, quote, first since Marx to treat alienation as the central critical category, end quote. A remarkable accomplishment because the 1844 manuscripts in which alienation appeared as the ground of Marxism had not yet been discovered. In the 1923 volume, Lukács shifted the focus of Marxism away from the positivist study of, quote, external nature and society, which it had become in the hands of the later Engels, the, quote, revisionist Edward Bernstein, and the, quote, orthodox Karl Kautsky, toward a study of the, quote, dialectical relation between the subject and the object, end quote. Lukács criticized Engels' influential book Anti-Düring for using the, quote, methods of the natural sciences, end quote, which, quote, reduces phenomena to their purely quantitative essence, end quote. To Lukács, Marx's dialectics, with its heavy debt to Hegel, quote, relates isolated facts to the totality, end quote. Marxism united theory and practice so that, quote, man himself is understood as the, quote, objective foundation of the historical dialectic, end quote. Lukács thereby rejected the, quote, determinism of Diomat and restored man as the subject of history. The Marxist analysis of capitalism could no longer remain merely the study of the economic base, but now centered on social relations. Elaborating on the fetishism chapter of Volume 1 of Capital, Lukács defined life under capitalism through the concept of reification, Verdinglichung, by which human interactions were conceived and experienced as relationships between things. Using the definition Marx gave for alienation, Lukács described reification as, quote, man's own activity, man's own labor becomes something objective and independent of him, something that controls him by virtue of an autonomy alien to man, Objectively, a world of objects and relations between things spring into being, Subjectively, a man's activity becomes estranged from him. It turns into a commodity. End quote. Lukács. Furthermore, the, quote, mechanized rationalization of the economy, end quote. The, quote, mechanized rationalization, end quote, of the economy, Weber's notion, inhibited human freedom. The capitalist conquest of nature became the capitalist control of man, as, quote, calculability must embrace every aspect of life, end quote. Lukács. The main thesis of the book, History and Class Consciousness, was the need not so much to destroy the private ownership of the means of production as to end alienation. Quote, reification is then the necessary immediate reality of every person living in capitalist society. Reification can be overcome only by constant and constantly renewed efforts to disrupt the reified structure of existence by concretely relating to the concretely manifested contradictions of the total development, by becoming conscious of the immanent meanings of these contradictions for the total development, What is crucial here is that there should be an aspiration to totality, end quote. Lukács. Marxism now led to the comprehension of the, quote, reified structure of existence, end quote, to the interactions of everyday life. Lukács still looked to the proletariat as the vehicle of this revolution because they, unlike the bourgeoisie, had a class consciousness that, quote, aspired to totality, end quote. Beyond the bourgeois, quote, standpoint of the individual, end quote, the proletariat by its place in the social structure could grasp the, quote, truth of the totality. Of course, the actual proletariat did no such thing. With the ebbing of the proletariat's revolutionary momentum throughout Europe after 1920, Lukács was forced into the position of distinguishing between empirical working-class consciousness and an ideal working class that grasped the totality. Lukács developed a concept of a, quote, ascribed or, quote, imputed proletarian consciousness in which the proletariat saw itself subjectively exactly as it objectively existed in the structure of capitalism. Ironically, this form of Western Marxism was but one step from Leninism. The party could represent the ideal proletariat as the subject-object of history when the actual proletariat did not. I think this is definitely it's definitely the case. Although I would not say that Marx, he's right in that past sentence. Ironically, this form of Western Marxism was but one step from Leninism. I don't think that there's a distinction between Western Marxism and, well, there is a distinction between Marxism and Leninism, Western Marxism and Leninism, but Western Marxism being fairly compatible with Leninism. Like, for instance, the main principal people of our early what you really could call Western Marxism, say Korsch and Lukács. Korsch went on to be a council communist and like a libertarian communist, and definitely it was probably the most anarchist friendly, for instance, of all the major anarchist thinkers of his time. But if you listen to listen to the audiobook on here by Douglas Kellner about Korsch, it seems to be the fact that Korsch was a pretty typical Communist Party politician in the early 1920s. So he was definitely still in the boat of Leninism, and the fact that he later became not a Leninist shouldn't distract from his Leninist period. Lukács, he recanted or whatever a lot of what he said, most of history and class consciousness, but he was certainly a Leninist. I think it was like he wrote a book on Lenin, I think, shortly after History and Class Consciousness. And maybe I'm wrong. I think it's him. Lenin, a study in the unity of his thought or something like that. He was a Leninist. Gramsci was a Leninist. And I think Gramsci was, in fact, maybe I'm wrong. I think there's this kind of like tendency to emphasize, like, I think Gramsci was really enthusiastic about the workers' councils that were emerging in the the Veneto Rossi or whatever, the two red years in Italy in like 1919 and 1920, or one of the 2 years 2 year periods that are in that ballpark. But I think that Gramsci was pretty involved in the Bolshevization of the Communist Party in Italy, and I think he was pretty responsible. I'm not totally sure, but I think he's pretty responsible for the marginalization of Bordiga, for instance. I'm not exactly sure about that, but just like, those three people, Korsch, Lukács, Gramsci, all those early Western Marxists were Leninists. So it doesn't seem like it's like it seems like there's kind of like this notion that there's some kind of scandal here between of Western Marxism having an iteration of Western Marxism being Leninist. I don't think there is particularly a scandal. I don't agree with Leninism, and I'm more sympathetic to Western Marxism, but definitely if you're just thinking of the main figures of Western Marxism, they're definitely Leninists. And, I think Adorno, at different points of his life, historically considered him some form of Leninist. But I don't know how that. I don't think, if you take his major work to be, I don't know how that reflects on, like Minima Moralia or Dialectic of Enlightenment or Negative Dialectics, right? Anyway, let me repeat that last sentence because I've been yakking on. Ironically, this form of Western Marxism was but one step from Leninism. The party could represent the ideal proletariat as the subject-object of history when the actual proletariat did not. Lukács and Salm articulated a libertarian existential Marxism that spoke of communism as the realization of, quote, authentic humanity, end quote, and man's, quote, total personality, end quote, that saw society as a, quote, totality of reciprocal mediated levels, that depicted capitalism as an alienated, reified world, and that pointed to the human subject as the ground of history. Quote, man must be able to comprehend the present as a becoming. He can do this by seeing in it the tendencies out of whose dialectical opposition he can make the future. And then when he does this, will the present be a process of becoming that belongs to him? End quote. Lukács. History and Class Consciousness. The book History and Class Consciousness was quickly labeled a, quote, deviation by the Marxist papacy in Moscow. The leading Russian theoretician, Bukharin, berated the book for its, quote, relapse into old Hegelianism, end quote, and Zinoviev, a politician who in this case breached the division of labor, branded it, quote, ultra-leftism, end quote. And I think Bukharin eventually becomes on to be like regarded as like a mechanist, right? And I'm rough on the actual history of like how like Marxism was officially understood at any given period in the Soviet Union, but that was definitely a thing, like the Bukharin controversy to some extent of like his mechanistic reading of dialectics or whatever, as manifested in his book. I believe he has a book from this period titled Historical Materialism, which would probably be an interesting thing to read in contrast to History and Class Consciousness. Anyway, Lukács himself in 1967 vaulted his work for the error of, quote, subjectivism, since it failed to enunciate the, quote, ontological objectivity of nature, end quote, and because it equated alienation and Fremdung with objectification, Vergegenständlichung, end quote. Footnote, see George Lichtheim's book, George Lukács, 1970. And it does say George, not Georg. And footnote. And footnote, for a recent critical estimate of history and class consciousness, see Gareth Stedman Jones, The Marxism of the Early Lukács, an Evaluation. I don't know what Gareth Stedman Jones' views on it would be. And I don't know how hegemonic views would have been in New Left Review, but I don't think like one of its spearheads, Perry Anderson, would have thought too highly of history and class consciousness, but I don't know. Anyway, end footnote. The link between Lukács and the French was in great measure forged by Lukacs and Goldmann, a pupil of Lukács. Goldmann used the dialectic in concrete studies, demonstrating its power as a method of research. His studies of Kant in 1952, Pascal, 1956, Racine, R-A-C-I-N-E, 1956, and Malraux, M-A-L-R-A-U-X, of 1964, related, in Lukácsian fashion, their, quote, visions of the world, end quote, to the social context without reducing their thought to a reflection of economic structures. Goldmann generalized his method in Les Sciences Humaines et la Philosophie. I guess it's the Human Sciences and Philosophy, I'm guessing, of 1952, pointing out that only the dialectic could make literary and philosophical works truly intelligible by revealing their importance in relation to human problems of a given epoch. Academics were urged to study the Marxist dialectic as a better way of examining their own fields. Goldmann's transmission of his teacher's concept of reification to France aided the development of existential Marxism. Reification in capitalist society, quote, masked the role of spiritual and psychic reality in the social relations between men, giving them the appearance of the natural attributes of things, ... end quote. Goldmann. The theoretical significance for Marxism of Goldmann's concept of reification was that it unveiled the interdependence of the superstructure and base, showing just how economic interactions mutilated consciousness and permitting a true evaluation of the autonomy and active role of consciousness. Further, it led to an awareness of the importance of psychology for Marxism, which Goldmann tried to develop through the use of Piaget's developmental psychology. Our main interest in Goldmann rests with his presentation of Lukács to the French as an existential Marxist. In his 1950 articles on Lukács, 1950 article, singular, on Lukács, Goldmann argued that Lukács' book, titled The Soul in Its Form, of 1910, was, quote, an important stage in the birth of modern existential philosophy, end quote. Goldmann. A two-edged sword, existentialism reflected the decline of the bourgeoisie, but also made for a return to, quote, concrete problems of living men, end quote. Goldmann. Existentialism represented a positive theoretical advance important for Marxists since it cut through the reification of the subject in bourgeois thought. For this reason, Lukács was interested in Kierkegaard. Goldmann also said that Heidegger, in the book Being and Time, was deeply indebted to Lukács. I don't know how much Lukács would actually, Heidegger would actually feel about that. Or maybe it's true. This was no acknowledgement on Heidegger's part. The German existentialist developed his thought with large help from a Marxist. A reversal of the usual pattern of filiation. What Goldmann failed to recount was that Lukács' own concept of reification in turn owed much to Bergson, who had great influence in Hungary during Lukács' youth. Bergson, who was so important to Sartre in the book Being and Nothingness, disputed rationalism and presented consciousness in its flowing temporal qualities. Footnote, see Henri Bergson's Time and Free Will, translated into English by an F. Pogson in 1960. End footnote. Regardless of who took from whom, Goldmann attempted to work out an existential Marxism through a synthesis of Lukács and Heidegger. Footnote, this attempt is most fully represented in the book by Lucien Goldmann, Lukács et Heidegger, or Lukács and Heidegger, with an intro by Y. Ish Agpur. End footnote. New section, Section 3 of the 1844 Manuscripts. After World War II, the Communist Party of France was shaken by a threat it could not have anticipated. The Communist Party of France had dealt in its fashion with numerous enemies in its short history. Trotskyists, socialists, liberals, fascists, conservatives, Catholics, monarchists, all sorts of intellectuals, academics, and journalists who derived fame or pleasure from polemicizing against Marx. Attacks were launched against Marx's character, against his philosophy, against his religious background, against his politics. He was heartless, cruel, dogmatic, lecherous, ruthless, totalitarian, a determinist who threatened human freedom and culture, and a violent, barbaric romantic, a utopian dreamer, etc., etc. Communist Party intellectuals looked with some disdain at these petty bourgeois red-baiters remaining unshaken in their faith. But now, after 1945, something more sinister was happening. Intellectuals of every conceivable stripe were proclaiming allegiance to Marxist thought, or at the very least paying homage to the power and fertility of his ideas. To the same extent that the French reading public was fascinated by existentialism, Marx's ideas triumphantly paraded through Paris to enthusiastic approval. To the chagrin of the Communist Party theorists, petty bourgeois intellectuals had successfully advertised Marxism as a philosophy of alienation. France was astir with chatter about alienation, bandying the name of Karl Marx in a manner entirely unsatisfactory to the official Marxists of the Communist Party. One second. Where am I? Taken completely off balance, the Communist Party intellectuals, apart from a few ineffective rejoinders, simply ignore the question of alienation until the late 1960s. I think there was also, I don't know about France, but I think there's just general hostility in the communist world to the concept of alienation. For instance, like people who embrace some kind of Marxist humanist position in the Eastern Bloc, say like Adam Schaff, were very much a minority. And also, like, if you take the work of Iron Fetcher, for instance, he talks about the hostility of the Eastern Bloc intellectuals and Communist Party intellectuals to this concept to a large extent. I'm getting the feeling that might be a little different in France. I'm not sure. And there's a footnote here about examples, but they're all in French, and it's just going to be... yeah, I'm not going to read that footnote. Then, with the fall of Stalinism, they tacked the concept of alienation onto their own Marxism without altering their politics or their general world picture. Not until the mid-1960s, after 2 decades of neglect, did some official communists following Louis Althusser mount a serious campaign to criticize and dampen the charismatic force of the concept of alienation. A peculiar aspect of this rediscovery of Marx was the prominent role played by Catholics, Sommerhausen, Bigot, Kojeve, and Kojeve. Their interest in Marx began during the Resistance. Many French Catholics were embarrassed by the Pope's relations with the Vichy government. Interest in Marx grew also from the worker-priest movement beginning in 1944, in which priests found themselves in a Marxist milieu. Hence, the studies of Marx's writings by the Catholics were an attempt to test the possibility of reconciliation. On the Marxist side, no overture was made until Girardi's book of the early 1960s. We may now turn to the French discussion of the 1844 manuscripts. Since the 1844 manuscripts are by now so well known, it would not be necessary to present a detailed analysis of them in these pages. Instead, we can proceed directly to the French criticisms of Marx's concept of alienation. New section, the Objections of the French. French commentators on the 1844 manuscript saw in Marx's idea of alienation the basis for regenerating a new Marxism that could be reconciled with their own, not always Marxist positions. Humanists discovered a, quote, humanist Marxism, moralists a, quote, ethical Marxism, and Catholics a Christian Marxism. At the very least, Marxism was no longer simply identifiable with Soviet Marxism or Marxist-Leninism. This fundamental rethinking of Marx's writings was not, however, without its criticisms of Marx's philosophy of alienation. In a few cases, these criticisms concluded in the total rejection of the position of the young Marx, and in most they led to the new directions for Marx's thought and action. A discussion of the alleged weaknesses of Marx's philosophy will bring out the tender spots in Marxism around which the debate between Marxism and Existentialism flourished. New section, or heading of this section. A. Economic reductionism. Marxism had long been attacked for its supposed reductionism. The well-known preface to the Critique of Political Economy of 1859 could be quoted to show that Marx minimized or totally eliminated the force of the, quote, superstructure in history, that is, politics, law, religion, philosophy, and art. As Marx put it, quote, in the social production of their existence, men inevitably enter into definite relations, which are independent of their will, namely relations of production appropriate to a given stage in the development of their material forces of production. The totality of these relations of production constitutes the economic structure of society, the real foundation on which arises a legal and political superstructure, and to which correspond definite forms of social consciousness. The mode of production of material life conditions the general process of social, political, and intellectual life. It is not the consciousness of men that determines their existence, but their social existence that determines their consciousness. End quote. Marx. This, quote, mechanical materialism, this, quote, economic determinism, end quote, can be traced through the Marxist tradition from Plekhanov to Kautsky and Bernstein to Lenin and Stalin. In reply, Western Marxists refer to Marx's political writings like the Civil War in France and especially the book The 18th Brumaire of Louis Bonaparte in order to show that Marx was cognizant of the autonomy and complexity of politics They can refer to the Hegelian and dialectical origins of Marxism, which viewed society as a totality of levels in reciprocal interaction without unilinear causes and effects. Finally, they can refer to Engels' often quoted letter to Joseph Bloch, in which the relative autonomy of the superstructure was affirmed. Only, quote, ultimately, or, quote, in the last instance, end quote, did the economy determine the superstructure, concludes Engels. The same controversy reemerged in France after 1945 in relation to the 1844 manuscripts. In The Phenomenology of Spirit, Hegel had connected alienation with self-consciousness. There was an alienation of consciousness when it objectified itself. Marx had refused to attribute alienation to this, quote, natural process, saving alienation for those moments only when the objectification was, quote, lost. He then argued that work activity was the source of alienation and the other functions of man, politics, religion, and so forth, were secondary elaborations of alienated labor. This implied that abolishing economic alienation would be the precondition for the end of other alienations and that no alienation could be overcome until work was humanized. It implied that non-economic social structures had no legitimacy. With the abolition of alienated labor, the state would wither, religion would vanish. Would art and philosophy also disappear? Of all the commentators, that's actually a good quote. It's something to think about. Of all the commentators on the 1844 manuscripts, the Catholic philosopher Jean Calvez most fully developed the arguments against Marx's stress on labor. Relentlessly, Calvez dissected Marx's concept of alienated labor, arguing that it oversimplified the possibility of liberation. Calvez's critique was typical in that it forced Marx's concept of alienation to explain questions that Marx answered only weakly. From the 1844 manuscripts, Calvez probed Marx's thought to see if it offered a, quote, coherent conception of the world, end quote, rather than an analysis of specific phenomena. Marx's concept of economic alienation could then be shown to fail to account fully for other modes of alienation, like, quote, psychological alienation, end quote. Marx had developed an analysis of economic alienation which Calvez accepted and had outlined the links of this alienation with other aspects of social alienation. Clearly, this focus on labor was a limitation of Marx's method, but a limitation is not necessarily a cause for rejection, since all theories have limits in scope. By asking Marx's concept of alienation to explain every instance of alienation, Calvez easily demonstrated that Marxism was not, quote, complete. Calvez rejected Marx where he might have called for new concepts to be integrated into Marxism. In this way, Calvez could accuse Marx of, quote, reducing all alienation to economic alienation. A Catholic, Calvez presented his argument against economic reductionism at bottom because this allowed him to raise the question of Marx's, quote, naturalism or atheism. For Marx, alienation could be completely overcome and man could become fully human without help from God, from a transcendent absolute. The dangerous conclusion for Calvez of Marx's concept of alienation was that man was the subject of history, that transcendence was eliminated from human reality, and that the absolute was immanent. To Calvez, without God, man could not distinguish human reality from natural reality, and as the whole development of Marxism indicated, history would be understood to follow the same blind, unconscious movement that characterized nature. In opposition to Calvez and other Catholic writers, Marxist commentators on the 1844 manuscripts founded, quote, economic and, quote, alienation on, quote, human alienation. Henri Lefebvre, a Communist Party member, always suspect to the leadership. Maximilien Robel, an independent social theorist, Council Communists, and Kostas Axelos, a Marxist philosopher, all tried to answer the charge of economic determinism. For Robel, Marx discovered his, quote, ethical vocation, end quote, while in Paris in 1844, founding a new, quote, ethic with his doctrine of the, quote, total man. Rubel confirmed that economic alienation was the base upon which rested, quote, all other alienations of man, end quote. But economic alienation itself rested on Marx's, quote, ethic, which he defined as the imperative to end alienation, to appropriate man's, quote, universal being, end quote. What Kojeve and indeed the orthodox Stalinists forgot was that, quote, Marx did not create and had no intention of creating a new system of political economy. Now that we have come to know the unpublished works, we can no longer misconceive the true nature of Marxism, end quote. Rubel. The great achievement of Marx for Rubel was to bring to the study of political economy as questionable ethical conception of alienation. Rather than, quote, economic determinism, Marxism was a, quote, human determinism, which provided the framework for a new, quote, sociology with a, quote, ethic and a, quote, true practice, end quote. Rubel. Basic to the idea of alienation was not the power of the economy over politics and religion, but the power of man to realize his humanity. The feverish excitement over the reading of the young Marx in France grew to a large degree from the revelation of his, quote, of this, quote, humanist passion, quote, in Marx, rooted in an anthropological theory of man as, quote, conscious free activity, end quote. Luke Sommerhausen, end quote. For Rubel, Marxism was now a coupling of scientific sociology and salvation ethics. Rubel forgot that ethical action came from autonomous individuals, whereas Marx's notion of praxis referred to groups without originating a concept of group ethics. Lefebvre, by far the best interpreter of Marx in France, broadly supported Rubel's sociological and ethical picture of Marx. The primary critical principle of Marxism for Lefebvre, which he found most clearly enunciated in the 1844 Manuscripts, was the concept of, quote, total man. This concept was in direct contradiction with, quote, economic man of bourgeois society, which is the real base for all notions of economic determinism. The concept of total man refuted all partial views of man, Christian man and economic man. Quote, what is the total man? Not physical, physiological, psychological, historical, economic, or social exclusively or unilaterally. It is all of these and more, especially the sum of these elements or aspects. It is their unity, their totality, their becoming. End quote. Lefebvre. Marxism for Lefebvre made no attempt to, quote, reduce religion to economics. Marxism allowed the alienated character of religion to be comprehended as a distorting expression of alienated social relations. It was the special character of religious myths to have their own force, their own power, their own alienating effects. Lefebvre explained how one form of alienation, fetishism, could attain such prominence as it had in history. Quote, fetishism properly so called only appeared when abstractions escaped the control of the thought and will of man. Thus, commercial value and money are only in themselves quantitative abstractions, abstract expressions of social human relations, but these abstractions materialize, intervene as entities in social life and in history, and end by dominating instead of being dominated. The natural and objective process then takes on a new meaning. The history of money, of capital, is only in one sense, the history of an abstraction. End quote. Lefebvre. Furthermore, Marx's naturalism did not lead to, quote, economism, as both Catholic and Stalinist interpretations of Marx asserted, but to an awareness of the human foundation of nature through man's historical struggle against nature. Alienation in the economic structure did not linearly, quote, determine alienation in other structures, but all were reciprocally interrelated within the movements of the historical totality. When, quote, causal determinisms appeared in history, they were themselves human, quote, productions and indicated the sectors man did not control. Fundamentally, history was the introduction of human finality, human purposes, replacing chance and causal determinism in society and nature. To Lefebvre, the humanization of society and nature was at the same time the humanization of man. The conscious human control of society and nature accompanied mutatis mutandis, the coming into consciousness of human potentials. Thus far from being a determinist philosophy, quote, Marxism is a practical philosophy of freedom, end quote, Lefebvre. In contrast to Lefebvre and Rubel, Axelos is unwilling to wipe out in one stroke all the difficulties of the primacy of the economy in Marx's concept of alienation. He was worried that Marx at times seemed to, quote, identify the totality of relations of production, with the totality of society, thus identifying a, quote, part with a, quote, whole, end quote, end quote. Axelos. I think that's who that is. The quote is from. Nevertheless, Axelos rejected the contention of Kojeve and others that Marx's concept of alienation collapsed all levels of society to the economy. Behind economic alienation and economic man lay human alienation and the total man. Quote, at the heart of all the various dimensions of alienation, economic, political, ideological, is situated human alienation, properly so called, alienation of human being, Quote, I don't know why I said quote. It's still the same quote. It is this man that Marxist humanism wishes to disalienate, end quote. By recalling the human genesis of alienation, Marxism comprehended social structures in a non-positivist critical manner. It did not invoke the economy as a metaphysical cause of everything else, but revealed how non-economic levels of alienation were possible. For Axelos, ideological or religious alienation arose under conditions of a, quote, underdeveloped technology, end quote. Without techniques to ameliorate the noxious effects of nature, helplessly vulnerable to the least variation in natural conditions, mankind surrounded itself with mythologies that bore the taint of its weaknesses. Axelos nonetheless admitted a dilemma in Marx's concept of alienation that was also the core of the existentialist reservations. Marx denied all assertions of an original, quote, golden age before alienation, affirming the alienated character of all previous history. Since all historic social formations were alienated and alienating, man was not the conscious subject of history, but the unconscious stumbling maker of his past. The actual character of human experience was blindness, so that social structures tended to have the quality of natural forces, and human subjectivity in practice took an entirely secondary place. In effect, then, history happened without man. At best, man was its secret, its hidden obscured force, not its overt creator. So we're going to cut that down. Motherfucker. Sorry about this. New heading B. The End of History. Equally disturbing to some commentators on Marx's concept of alienation was his apparent conviction that with the abolition of alienation, through the triumph of communism, history would come to an end. Marxism became self-contradictory, these critics maintained, when it prophesied a total turnabout in human affairs. From the tragic darkness of alienation, man was seen emerging in full brilliance with all his potentialities realized at the end of time. The eschatological quality that Marxism always bore was only intensified, not at all clarified, by the, quote, naive hopes presented in the 1844 manuscripts. Instead of toning down the strident Prometheanism of Marxism, the young Marx only made matters worse. Assuming the abolition of private property and alienated labor would end history, would all other alienations disappear as well? When philosophy was realized, as Marx put it, would there be no more philosophy? Again, Jean-Yves Calvez was the most comprehensive critic in revealing the lofty, misguided pretensions of Marx's concept of the end of history. He was impatient with Marx's prognostications. After following Marx's careful and illuminating examination of the complex mediations of man, nature, and society, in which he unfolded convincingly level upon level of alienation, in which every construction of man was shown to be partial and incomplete, after all this, we were expected to believe that in one thrust all imperfections would be swept off the earth. Even the sympathetic personalist Jean Lacroix could not abide Marx's vision in which the temporal dialectic, which moved only by internal contradiction, would be asserted in some end of history. How could Marx, a dialectician, Calvez queried, possibly maintain a state in which alienation was permanently ended? Reflecting his displeasure with Soviet communism, reflecting his displeasure with Soviet communism, Calvez would not allow the simple solution that the proletariat, suffering from alienation, would turn against their oppression, eliminate it at its source, and carry mankind to the threshold of a de-alienated world. The class struggle might well end in a dictatorship of the proletariat, and as Stalinist Russia demonstrated, this short transitional phase on the road to pure communism had its, quote, own complexity, and, quote, its own political struggles. There was nothing to convince Calvez that the proletariat in power would not behave exactly like previous ruling classes and erect a state apparatus that would alienate political power as efficiently, if not more so, than in the past. In fact, Bigot, another Catholic, contended there was a necessary connection between Marx's notion of the end of history and the, quote, totalitarianism and, quote, of Bolshevik Russia. Footnote. Both Bigot and Axelos spoke of man's, quote, will to power, end quote, as independent of economic alienation. They here return to abstract arguments about, quote, human nature, end quote. Quote, but does not this forget a fundamental element of human psychology, the will to power, end quote. Bigot. Put in this way, the argument is a mystification. The Marxist reply is that where one cannot identify a specific social structure leading to a specific alienation, the question of the human nature of the phenomenon must remain open and not become an ideological obstacle to eliminating those social structures which are known to be alienating. Lefebvre's answer to the alleged universality of the will to power is the best. Quote, Marx was not an egalitarian. He recognized the fact of different capacities and the need for command in industry. Alienation did not come from this, but from the fixing of directing functions. The functions became controlled by a ruling class, and the state is formed which separates itself from other functions, unquote. Lefebvre. And I don't know if Lefebvre holds on to that position later in his life. Or I'm curious if he did. I don't know much about Lefebvre. Kojeve warned his readers that the, quote, nonsense of the end of history must be extracted from Marxism before Catholics could profitably synthesize the two doctrines. Marx's expectation that religion would vanish with the outset of classless society was ultimately rooted in his, quote, unverified, and, quote, projection into the, quote, future experience of the total man, end quote. Even those commentators less encumbered by religious presuppositions than Kojeve and Bigot had reservations about Marx's futurology. Given the failure of the proletariat to vindicate Marx's dreams, François Châtelet, for instance, cautioned against the dialectic of alienation in which, quote, temporal unhappiness, end quote, contained its own internal remedy. In the eyes of Axelos, this visionary strain in Marx could only be understood as, quote, Jewish prophetism, end quote. Axelos. Reflecting his anti-technological Heideggerian proclivities, Axelos found alienation, quote, more basic to history, end quote, than Marx thought. Against Marx's prediction of a, quote, happy end, end quote, to history, he forecast a residual continuing alienation originating from, quote, modern technical machinery, end quote. Marx. End quote. That's from Axelos. Communism might well abolish some aspects of alienated labor, but, quote, where Marx becomes truly difficult to go along with is where he speaks of the suppression of the division of labor, end quote. Axelos. Axelos dismissed Marx's 48th dream of people laboring at diversified tasks in flagrant violation of the division of labor as, quote, touching in its idyllic naivete, end quote. Axelos. Since the, quote, gigantic and universal development of productive technique ends in a reality much more problematical than ... hunting, fishing, and criticizing according to one's pleasure and time, end quote. Axelos. What Axelos perceived behind Marx's vision of the end of history was a new metaphysics. Only the metaphysical value Marx attributed to, quote, technique allowed him to envision the end of alienation through the perfection of technique. Quote, prolonging all Western metaphysics, ... Marx wants to transcend radical philosophy as the search for truth, as thought, theory, and knowledge, ... It is the productivity of men which makes nature and totality being and becoming for man, ... The human collectivity, ... As the foundation of a planetary technique becomes the producer of all that is, end quote. Axelos. It would not be enough for man to reappropriate his creative labor in order for history to end in this total mastery of nature. The arguments against Axelos and Kojeve that substantiated Marx's notion of the end of alienation underscored the ahistorical position of the skeptics. From the standpoint of the communists, de Saint and Lefebvre, the critics of the theory of the end of alienation, spoke from a position of the contemplative philosopher who was not oriented towards praxis. Indeed, Axelos explicitly proclaimed his contemplative stance, wishing only to present Marx's thought as a, quote, philosophy. Quite necessarily, if one made Marxism a pure philosophy, it would have all the characteristic faults of previous philosophy, what Axelos called its, quote, metaphysical, end quote, character, its tendency to privilege one aspect of reality over the rest. But, argued Lefebvre, Marx's privileging of technique derived from the actual situation during the Industrial Revolution. Only from within contemporary developments did Marx voice his critical concept of alienation. In the practice of technology, the prospect of ending work, and to the degree that history was the history of work, of ending history, was posited historically. Marx argued that the alienating form in which industrialization developed would have to be abolished before the human potential for self-determination could be realized. To the extent that previous history suppressed this potential, the, quote, history would be ended if the suppression were ended. The famous passage where Marx spoke of communism as the riddle of history solved does not imply the end of all, quote, contradictions, end quote, or human woes. In Lefebvre's words, quote, the organization of the human community will not put an end to history, but rather to man's, quote, prehistory, his, quote, natural history, end quote, before he became fully differentiated from the animals. It will inaugurate the era of an authentic humanity in which man will control his own destiny and try at last to resolve the specifically human problems, those of happiness, knowledge, love, and death. He will have been freed from the conditions that made these problems insoluble." End quote. Lefebvre. The question of the end of alienation has its corollary the question of the origin of alienation. Although Marx spoke of the end of alienation, he refused to attempt in the 1844 manuscripts to search for its remote beginnings. Catholic critics like Kojeve were disturbed by this because their own mode of thinking was inured to concepts of absolute beginnings, i.e. God's creation of the world. For Marx, however, the question of the origin of the world, like that of the origin of alienation, was false and non-dialectical. In an amusing passage, Marx beckoned the philosopher of the beginnings of things to recall that in order to think the beginning, one had to abstract from all existing phenomena, which put one in the somewhat awkward position of hypothesizing one's own non-existence. If you ask about the creation of nature and man, you thus abstract from man and nature. You assert them as non-existent, and yet want to prove them to you as existing, I say to you, give up your abstraction, and you will also give up your question. Or if you want to maintain your abstraction, be consistent, and if you think of man and nature as non-existent, think of yourself as non-existent, as you too are nature and man. Do not question me, for as soon as you think and question, your abstraction from the existence of nature and man makes no sense. Or are you such an egoist that you assert everything as nothing and yet want yourself to exist? End quote. Marx. In dialectical thinking within the concrete totality of becoming and oriented toward future action, questions of genesis lost their urgency. When Marx did turn to questions of origin, as in the German ideology, he spoke of origins as, quote, premises, necessary to organize a presentation only. But if we have no knowledge of past, non-alienated social structure, how can we be sure that we know what alienation is? If we cannot isolate alienation from the social structure, hold it constant, how can we test it as a dependent or independent variable in specific historical contexts? Marx's answer to this question derived from his rejection of positivism and positivism's corollary, analytical reasoning. Dialectical procedure aimed not to, quote, isolate phenomena, and then, quote, test them, but to grasp them within history, to comprehend their mediations and relations within the totality. Certainty did not derive from scientific procedures, but ultimately only from action. The concept of alienation provided Marx with a critical tool that could specify the concrete structures of society which caused men to lose power over their own existence. To some French Marxists, the idea of alienation did not yet yield the absolute knowledge of idealism or the probable knowledge of positivism, rather revealed the nature of the world in such a way that men and women could make the world and themselves more human. New section, Section C, Homo economicus. The third major objection to the idea of alienation in the 1844 manuscripts was again one that had troubled Marxism from its inception. Even if one granted that economic alienation was not reductive and that the, quote, end of history was not an eschatological mythic paradise, Marx was still open to the charge that his anthropology, his concept of man, reduced human value to economic value, human interactions to instrumental or technical interactions, human experience to work experience. Footnote. And there's a quote from the thesis on Feuerbach here that says, "The question whether human thinking can reach objective truth is not a question of theory, but a practical question. In practice, man must prove the truth, that is, actuality and power, this sidedness of his thinking. The dispute about the actuality or non-actuality of thinking isolated from practice, is a purely scholastic question, end quote. Marx's emphasis. And the quote is from Marx, obviously. What's the last sentence I read? Even if one granted the economic alienation was not reductive and that the, quote, end of history was not an eschatological myth of paradise, Marx was still open to the charge that his anthropology, his concept of man, reduced human value to economic value, human interactions to instrumental or technical interactions, human experience to work experience. Footnote. The newest theorist of the Frankfurt School, Jürgen Habermas, continues to make these claims. See the book Toward a Rational Society, translated by J. Shapiro. End footnote. Some commentators, notably Axelos, insisted that there was an ambiguity in the historical task of human emancipation as posed by Marx. Marx's, quote, romantic, expansive vision of the new man who developed all sides of his personality remained in contradiction with his, quote, positivism because his, quote, admiration for technical progress, end quote. Let me repeat that sentence. Some commentators, notably Axelos, insisted that there was an ambiguity in the historical task of human emancipation as posed by Marx. Marx's, quote, romantic, expansive vision of the new man who developed all sides of his personality remained in contradiction with his, quote, positivism, his, quote, admiration for technical progress, end quote. Axelos. Wait, is that Axelos? Yes. Quote, modern technique was the secret motor force driving history toward communism, toward a, quote, planetary technique, end quote, a prospect that reduced all values to technical values, creativity, productivity, leaving Marxism with but one thought, technology. The fear of technology in Axelos' commentary on the 1844 manuscripts rested on the assumption that mankind could not, at the same time, build an automated technology that would liberate man from toil while discovering the springs of non-economic creativity. In the 1844 manuscripts, Marx had dismissed the political economist's image of Homo economicus by asserting that, quote, beauty was the principle of human production, by depicting communist man as a fully integrated, all-round, somewhat Hellenic species, not as a utilitarian petty bourgeois shopkeeper. Still, for Axelos, the very project of technical development and the value Marx did indeed place on it evoked a nightmare of soulless technicians and organization men. Against Rubel, who saw communist society, I don't know why he put each poster puts communism in starts communist, the word communist, the capital C. That is not how Rubel. There's always a distinction between capital C communist and lowercase c communist. Capital C communist refers to like communist things affiliated to like actual communist parties, not communism in the Marxian sense of the term. Against Rubel, who saw communist society as the, quote, renaissance of the archaic rural commune, end quote, Axelos envisioned only a sterile, bland, technical wasteland. Marx made his position clear about an economic man in 1843 in his essay on the Jewish question. The egoism of economic man was dissected as a false consciousness, striving for autonomy, thinking itself free when in fact was shaped and distorted by the laws of the market, by the split between public life and private life, by the fetishism of money. To economic man, the structures of society appeared as natural facts, and he conceived his own pursuit for gain as, quote, rational, when in fact his pecuniary behavior constrained and fragmented his consciousness. None of this reasoning was particularly original. Hegel had made similar arguments in the Phenomenology of Spirit. in the sections on utilitarianism and, quote, noble and base consciousness, end quote, to which Marx referred explicitly in the 1844 manuscripts. It must not be forgotten that Marx defined his position on labor and the self in terms of the Hegelian tradition. From the outset, he was opposed to the, quote, homo economicus, end quote, of English and French political economy. The discussion in the 1844 manuscripts of human value and labor was framed as a modification of Hegel's position. Marx argued that Hegel was correct in the importance he placed on labor in the dialectic of consciousness, but he conceived labor and the product of labor only in their, quote, abstract sense, as the, quote, thought of the product, end quote. On the positive side, quote, the great thing in Hegel's phenomenology and its final result is simply that Hegel grasps the nature of work and comprehends objective man, authentic, because actual, as the result of his own work, end quote. Assuming that's Marx. Yeah, it is. Marx wanted to define man as a, quote, objective being whose self-realization was possible only through the process of objectification, of work. To Marx, the value of work did not reduce itself to that of the product, but inhered in the human value of self-realization. Man creates himself in the process of work. Quote, man creates and establishes only objects because he is established through objects, because man is fundamentally part of nature. In the act of establishing this objective being does not therefore descend from its, quote, pure activity, end quote, to the creation of the object, but its objective product merely confirms its objective activity. Its activity is that of an objective natural being, end quote. Marx. All human activity, even thinking, was a kind of labor in the sense that it involved the objectification of the self. To Marx, labor characterized human activity better than Hegel's notion of consciousness because it rooted man in nature, centered attention on his sensuous reality, and thus grasped humanity concretely. Even one of man's activities included the exercise of some capacity or the recognition of some need as well as a relation to an external phenomenon. The mode in which man connects his needs and capacities to the world defined the structure of society. Marx altered Hegel's notion of self-realization by including the dialectic of self-consciousness within the wider dialectic of labor. He called this position, quote, naturalism or humanism, end quote, as against, quote, idealism and materialism, end quote. If concrete man in contemporary society was actually homo economicus, that was a specific realization of man open to criticism. To Lefebvre and others, nothing could be further from Marx's intention than reducing human value to the value of the products of the proletariat, of reducing the self to the bourgeois self, and of reducing human interactions to the reified instrumental relations of market society. To them, Marx's concept of labor grasped labor as, quote, man's act of self-creation, end quote. Man was not reduced to a, quote, tool-making animal, end quote, but, quote, tool-making, end quote, was viewed as a human process. However distorted to historical forms, as deeply human as praying or philosophizing. I think the tool-making animal concept is generally attributed to Benjamin Franklin. New section. Two Marxes or one. With the significance of Marx's idea of alienation for a critical comprehension of contemporary society established, the commentators faced a question that was new, at least in its importance in the Marxist tradition. With the appearance in French of the 1844 manuscripts, as well as the book The Holy Family and the German Ideology, the nature of Marxism appeared entirely changed. One could now more easily rethink all of Marx's writings down to capital in the light of the idea of alienation. But it could also be argued, as the Communist Party did in the late 1940s and 1950s, and the Structuralists did in the 1960s, that the idea of alienation was only central to Marx's youthful pre-communist Hegelian period. That the, quote, mature Marx of the the 1850s, 1860s, and 1870s, had rid himself completely of his early, quote, romanticism. In this case, there was two Karl Marxes, not one. A scientific revolutionary old Marx, the founder of socialism, and a philosophical, confused young Marx, lost in the maze of Hegelian speculation and romantic inspiration. The question of the two Marxes was shaped to some degree by the political situation in post-liberation France. The mood in France was one of great expectations for social reconstruction, mingled with fears of a bipolar world dominated by the United States and the Soviet Union, in which France and even all Europe would be overshadowed and forgotten. It was urgent for the left to articulate a direction for France that everyone, from Christian Democrats and Socialists to the Communist Party, could approve. To Jean Lacroix, writing in Esprit in May 1945, France needed a new definition of socialism that would be a, quote, integral humanism, end quote. Quote, the role of France is to be the nation of reconciliation between Soviet planism minus dictatorship and Anglo-Saxon democracy less capitalism, end quote. The, quote, old socialism would have to be, quote, transcended. In this political context, the idea of alienation could provide a pivot for debate, but the French had not yet related the idea of alienation to the concepts of worker self-management, the new working class, and advanced technological society. More immediately, the unity of the left disintegrated shortly after 1944, largely because of the centripetal pulls of the U.S. and the USSR. As the Communist Party took on an increasingly defensive posture, a Marxist theory centering on the idea of alienation looked more like an anti-communist threat to the Soviet Union than the source of a new popular front. In this way, the concept of alienation became a political question in itself, with communists favoring an old Marx shorn of the idea of alienation, and anti-communists, quote, humanists, end quote, preferring an exclusively young Marx who dealt with, quote, man and not with, quote, economics. Almost unanimously, the commentators on the 1844 manuscripts, from the communist Lefebvre to the Catholic Kojeve, took the position that there was but one Marx, and that the concept of alienation in the 1844 manuscripts was the fulcrum of all of Marx's thought. For Kojeve, quote, it was impossible to separate the young Marx from the old, end quote. For Bigot, the idea of alienation was at the base of all Marx's works, even capital. For Hyppolite, the 1844 manuscripts, quote, contained perhaps the meaning and foundation of his entire philosophy, end quote. Auguste Cornu called them a, quote, decisive turning point in the development of Marx's thought, end quote. Auguste Cornu being like a French Marxist who I think after the war moved to East Germany. I think he's a Marx scholar, probably of the Stalinist variety. That's just a guess, though. But we can assume so. I mean, a lot of people went to East Germany, you know. For instance, Ernst Bloch. And his relationship to Stalinism, I think, is kind of complicated as well, but I'm not sure. Anyway, Cornu called them a, quote, decisive turning point in the development of Marx's thought. For Rebel, the, quote, ethic of the 1844 manuscripts was that of capital. In the words of Axelis, the 1844 manuscripts were the, quote, touchstone of Marxian thought, end quote. For Roger Garaudy, they were the, quote, active birth of Marxism, end quote. And, quote, there was no rupture between the mature works and the youthful critical reflections, ... end quote. Roger Garaudy. For George Grivich, they, quote, defined for the first time his complete sociological and philosophical position, end quote. Hegelianism, too, was seen not as something incidental to Marx, something he forgot later on. The commentators recognized that the concept of alienation received serious philosophical consideration, first in Hegel's phenomenology, and then it was, after all, Hegel who developed the dialectic, which Marx admittedly transformed, but was still indebted to. The arguments over the precise connection between Marx and Hegel were extremely intricate. Oversimplified, the affiliation looked like this. Marx rethought Hegel's phenomenology in composing the 1844 manuscripts and used Hegel's science of logic in structuring capital. Although Marx's last useful work was generally accepted as the German ideology of 1846, the, quote, materialized Hegelian problematic continued to inspire Marx throughout his writings. Only after the role of the 1844 manuscripts was fixed in French thinking did the study of the Grundrisse in 1857-58 demonstrate Marx's continuing, quote, mature and, quote, dependence on Hegel. In sum, the 1844 manuscripts left the French with a new Marx, for whom history moved on several levels simultaneously. The, quote, forces of production, end quote, were progressively developed with the inner contradiction of private ownership and socialization. The, quote, relations of production, end quote, engendered the contradictions of the class struggle, but underlying the whole drama of human history was the increasing alienation of human powers that dialectically prepared the ground for emancipation, for a humanization of man, in which nature was to be transfigured in a higher symbiosis of man and nature. It was this Marx who became the center of the debate with existentialists and who was later exported from France to Eastern Europe, especially to Yugoslavia and Czechoslovakia, and in a psychologized form to the United States. It's a very interesting sentence. I haven't really heard about this. I haven't really heard about this in the things that I've read about Yugoslavia, about anything about the importation of a existentialist or humanist reading of Marx from France to Yugoslavia or Eastern Europe. I haven't heard that before. But maybe that's the case. Maybe people like Kojeve and Markovich and all the other people whose names I'm blanking on right now, Stoyanovich, and so on and so forth, did draw influence from French Marxism, but I don't know. Anyway, even with the concept of alienation, Marxism contained many problems. The concept of alienation itself remained abstract in the 1844 manuscripts and would have to be applied to the specific conjuncture of the mid-20th century. Also, Marx's epistemology, in which theory depended on praxis, was undeveloped and did not explain the relative autonomy of theory such that it could distinguish between science and technology. Further, the concept of alienation relied heavily on a philosophical anthropology that came very close to the abstract anthropology of bourgeois thought. For existentialists, even the revised Marxism did not account for the immediate experience of alienation, for the interiority of men in the alienated world. Above all, Marxism did not account for the apparent lack of a revolutionary working class in the West. Since Marxism was theoretically dependent on the praxis of the working class, this absence was exceedingly embarrassing, to say the least. All right, and that is the end of the second chapter. Oh man, second chapter. Yeah, the second chapter. The last chapter was the Hegel Renaissance, and this chapter was titled The Rediscovery of Marx and the Concept of Alienation, with the headings Stalinism and the French Communist Party, Lukacs and Goldmann, the 1844 manuscripts, the Objections of the French, and the Two Marxes or One. Thank you so much for listening. I don't know when I'll read this next part, but this next chapter of this book is titled The Early Sartre, Existentialist Concept of Freedom, with the headings The Question of Sartre's Radicalism, Freedom to Create Oneself, Bad Faith, Freedom in Relations with Oneself, The Situation. Thank you so much for listening.